If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the book. Chapter 1, Seeds of Catastrophe, The Tensions Before the Storm. Part 1, The Rival Empires and European Expansionism. By 1900, the great powers of Europe had transformed the world into their personal chessboard. Britain commanded the seas and ruled over India, vast swaths of Africa, and territories scattered across every continent. The British Empire stretched so far that the sun never set on its dominions, generating immense wealth that flowed back to London's banks and factories. France controlled much of West and North Africa, while carving out spheres of influence in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. These two nations had spent centuries building their empires, and they guarded their colonial treasures jealously. Germany watched this colonial feast with growing frustration. Despite its industrial might and military prowess, the newly unified German Empire had arrived late to the imperial banquet. Kaiser Wilhelm II demanded Germany's place in the sun, pushing German explorers, merchants, and gunboats into Africa and the Pacific. German colonies in Southwest Africa, East Africa, and scattered Pacific islands seemed meager compared to British and French holdings. German industrialists complained that colonial markets remained closed to them, while their rivals prospered from captive consumers and cheap raw materials. The scramble for Africa intensified these rivalries beyond mere economics. When European powers carved up the continent at the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, they created a patchwork of competing claims that sparked constant friction. British and German interests collided in East Africa. French expansion bumped against British influence along the Nile. Every railway built, every mining concession granted, every trade route established became a potential flashpoint between rival empires. Russia pursued its own imperial ambitions, pushing south toward the warm water ports of the Black Sea and Mediterranean, while expanding eastward across Asia. This expansion brought Russian interests into direct conflict with Austria-Hungary in the Balkans and with Britain in Central Asia and the Middle East. The great game between Russia and Britain played out across Afghanistan and Persia, where spies, diplomats, and soldiers maneuvered for advantage. Each colonial conflict echoed back to Europe, poisoning relationships between the great powers. When French and British forces nearly clashed at Fashoda in Sudan in 1898, war fever gripped both nations. German support for the Boers against Britain during the South African War outraged British public opinion. These overseas rivalries made European diplomacy increasingly hostile and suspicious. Colonial competition became entangled with national prestige in dangerous ways. Newspapers celebrated imperial victories and denounced foreign rivals. Political leaders found that aggressive colonial policies won popular support at home. Military officers and colonial administrators pushed for expansion, creating facts on the ground that their governments felt compelled to defend. What began as commercial competition evolved into tests of national will and honor. By 1914, this imperial competition had created a web of resentments and rivalries that made European cooperation nearly impossible. Each nation viewed the other's colonial gains as threats to their own security and prosperity. The stage was set for these global tensions to transform any European conflict into a worldwide catastrophe. Part 2. The Alliance Web: Entangling Commitments. The imperial rivalries that had poisoned European relations for decades might have remained manageable if the continent's major powers had stood alone. Instead, they chose to bind themselves together in a series of military alliances that would transform any local dispute into a continental catastrophe. Germany found itself increasingly isolated as the 20th century dawned. Otto von Bismarck's careful diplomacy had once kept potential enemies divided, but his successors abandoned this delicate balance. The new Kaiser Wilhelm II allowed the crucial reinsurance treaty with Russia to lapse in 1890, pushing the Tsarist Empire toward France. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. France and Russia, despite their vastly different political systems, discovered they shared a common fear of German power. In 1894, they formalized the Franco-Russian alliance, creating a two-front threat that haunted German military planners. The alliance promised mutual aid if either nation faced attack from Germany or Austria-Hungary. For the first time since 1871, France was no longer diplomatically isolated. Germany responded by strengthening ties with Austria-Hungary, formalizing what would become known as the Dual Alliance. These two empires, bound by language and culture, promised to support each other against any Russian aggression. Italy later joined this partnership, though its commitment remained questionable. The Central Powers had formed their own protective bloc. Britain initially remained aloof from these continental entanglements. The island nation preferred what it called splendid isolation, intervening only when the balance of power seemed threatened. However, Germany's aggressive naval building program and colonial ambitions gradually pushed Britain toward France and Russia. The Entente Cordiale between Britain and France in 1904 began as a colonial agreement, settling disputes in Africa and Asia. Yet it evolved into something far more significant. When Germany challenged French influence in Morocco, Britain supported its new partner. The relationship deepened through military conversations and naval cooperation agreements. Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War temporarily weakened the Franco-Russian partnership, but also made the Tsarist regime more dependent on French financial support. When Britain and Russia resolved their own imperial disputes in 1907, the Triple Entente was complete. Europe now faced two opposing camps. These alliances operated like a vast mechanical system where pressure on any one component would trigger movement throughout the entire structure. Military planners began coordinating strategies across national boundaries. The German Schlieffen Plan assumed France and Russia would fight together. French Strategy Plan 12 anticipated German aggression. Each nation's war plans became dependent on their allies' actions. The alliance system created a dangerous rigidity in European diplomacy. Leaders found themselves prisoners of commitments made years earlier under different circumstances. Secret clauses and vague language in treaty texts left room for interpretation, but also for miscalculation. What had been designed as defensive arrangements began to look increasingly offensive to potential enemies. By 1914, Europe resembled a house built with dominoes. The alliance system had created a structure where the fall of one piece would inevitably bring down all the others. Local conflicts could no longer remain local. Any spark in this interconnected web of commitments would set the entire continent ablaze. Part 3. Arms races and national pride. The dangerous rigidity created by these alliances coincided with another troubling development across Europe. Nations were transforming themselves into military powerhouses on a scale never before witnessed in peacetime. In shipyards across Germany and Britain, the sound of hammers rang day and night. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II had announced his intention to challenge British naval supremacy, launching a fleet construction program that sent shockwaves through London. British admirals watched with growing alarm as German dreadnought battleships slid down the ways, each one a steel monument to imperial ambition. The Royal Navy, accustomed to ruling the waves without question, suddenly faced a rival, determined to match their strength ship for ship. This naval competition consumed enormous resources. Both nations poured gold into their fleets like water into a bottomless well. German taxpayers funded massive naval budgets, while British citizens watched their government respond with even larger expenditures. The press in both countries turned every new ship launch into a national celebration, every technical advancement into proof of superior engineering and national character. On land, the competition proved equally intense. France expanded its army and extended military service, haunted by memories of defeat in 1870. Germany responded by increasing the size of its forces and perfecting new artillery designs. Russia mobilized its vast population into ever larger military formations. Each nation's preparations prompted matching responses from its neighbors. New technologies made this arms race particularly dangerous. Machine guns could now cut down advancing soldiers by the hundreds. Artillery pieces fired shells with devastating accuracy over previously unimaginable distances. Military planners studied these innovations and concluded that future wars would be brief but incredibly destructive affairs. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. but it drove the logic of rapid mobilization that made conflict seem both inevitable and necessary. Public opinion embraced this military buildup with enthusiasm that bordered on hysteria. Newspapers celebrated military parades and published detailed accounts of new weapons systems. Politicians discovered that military spending was popular with voters who took pride in their nation's growing strength. Peace movements existed, but found themselves drowned out by the drumbeat of nationalism. Each nation's military preparations created genuine fear in its neighbors. German army expansion alarmed the French, who saw it as preparation for revenge. British naval construction convinced Germans that Britain sought to strangle their commerce and colonial ambitions. Russian military reforms terrified Austria-Hungary, which saw Slavic nationalism as an existential threat to its multinational empire. This cycle of fear and response created a momentum all its own. Military leaders in every capital began to believe that war was not just possible, but probable. They developed detailed plans for mobilization and attack, assuming that whoever moved first would gain decisive advantages. By 1914, Europe bristled with weapons and armies trained for conflict, while public opinion in each nation had been conditioned to expect and even welcome the test of battle that would prove their country's superiority once and for all. Part 4. Balkan powder keg and rising tempers. The arms race had created a Europe ready for war, but it was in the fractured Balkans where that war would actually begin. This southeastern corner of Europe had become a cauldron of competing nationalisms, imperial ambitions, and ancient hatreds that made conflict almost inevitable. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had ruled much of the Balkan Peninsula with an iron fist, but by 1900, the once mighty empire was crumbling, earning the nickname the Sick Man of Europe. As Ottoman control weakened, the peoples who had lived under Turkish rule for generations began to dream of independence. Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, and Greeks all harbored deep resentments against their former rulers and fierce pride in their distinct identities. The vacuum left by Ottoman decline created a perfect storm. Serbia, having gained independence in 1878, burned with ambition to unite all South Slavs under its banner. This dream of a greater Serbia directly threatened Austria-Hungary, which controlled millions of Slavs in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Austro-Hungarian Empire knew that Serbian success would inspire its own Slavic populations to rebel, potentially tearing the multinational empire apart. Russia saw opportunity in Balkan chaos. As the largest Slavic nation and protector of Orthodox Christians, Russia viewed itself as the natural champion of Balkan Slavs against both Ottoman Muslims and Austrian Catholics. Supporting Serbian ambitions gave Russia a chance to extend its influence toward the Mediterranean and strike at its Austrian rival. The Balkan Wars of 1912-1913 turned simmering tensions into open warfare. First, an alliance of Balkan states drove the Ottomans almost entirely out of Europe. Then the victors immediately turned on each other, fighting over the spoils. Serbia emerged from these conflicts doubled in size and bursting with confidence, while Austria-Hungary watched in horror as its southern neighbor grew stronger and more threatening. Each success made Serbia bolder. Nationalist groups like the Black Hand began plotting against Austrian rule in Bosnia. Young Slavic radicals spoke openly of assassination and revolution. The Austrian government, seeing its empire's survival at stake, grew more determined to crush Serbian ambitions before they spread further. By 1914, the Balkans had become Europe's most dangerous flashpoint. Every great power had interests there, and every local conflict threatened to drag in the major empires through their competing commitments. The region buzzed with spies, revolutionaries, and military advisors from the great capitals. The powder keg was packed and ready. Nationalist fervor had armed the fuse, imperial rivalry had provided the spark, and the alliance system ensured that any explosion would spread far beyond the Balkans themselves. All that remained was for someone to light the match that would set the world ablaze. That moment would come on a sunny summer morning in Sarajevo, when a young Bosnian Serb would fire the shots that changed history forever. Part 5. The Fatal Encounter in Sarajevo. On the morning of June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie stepped from their train into the sunlit streets of Sarajevo. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne had come to inspect military maneuvers in this restive corner of his empire. Bosnia-Herzegovina, annexed just 6 years earlier, seethed with resentment among its Serbian population who dreamed of joining their ethnic kin in independent Serbia. Among the crowds lining the streets stood 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, a consumptive student whose frail body housed revolutionary fire. He belonged to the Black Hand, a secret Serbian nationalist organization that viewed Franz Ferdinand not as a potential reformer, but as a symbol of foreign oppression. The Archduke's very presence in Sarajevo on St. Vitus Day, a sacred Serbian holiday commemorating a medieval battle, felt like deliberate provocation. The assassination plot had already stumbled once that morning. Another conspirator had thrown a bomb at the royal motorcade, but it bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded behind them, wounding several officers. Franz Ferdinand, displaying remarkable composure, insisted on visiting the wounded in the hospital. This act of concern would prove fatal. The royal driver, confused by last-minute route changes, took a wrong turn onto Franz Josef Street. As he struggled to reverse the vehicle, it stalled directly in front of Schiller's Delicatessen, where Princip had stopped for a sandwich, having given up hope after the failed bombing. Fate had delivered the Archduke within 5 feet of his assassin. Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots from his Browning pistol. The first bullet pierced Franz Ferdinand's neck, severing his jugular vein. The second struck Sophie in the abdomen. The Archduke, blood streaming from his mouth, pleaded with his dying wife to live for their children. Both were dead within minutes. The shots that rang out in Sarajevo that summer morning reverberated across Europe like thunder before a storm. What began as the desperate act of a teenage revolutionary quickly transformed into an international crisis. Austria-Hungary, long frustrated by Serbian support for Bosnian nationalists, saw an opportunity to crush its troublesome neighbor once and for all. The assassination provided the spark that Austro-Hungarian leaders had been seeking. Within weeks, they would deliver an ultimatum to Serbia so harsh it seemed designed to be rejected. When Serbia accepted most but not all demands, Austria-Hungary declared war. Russia, bound by Slavic solidarity and treaty obligations, began mobilizing to support Serbia. Germany, honoring its alliance with Austria-Hungary, prepared for conflict. The dominoes that had been carefully arranged across Europe began to fall. The alliance system that was meant to preserve peace through deterrence instead guaranteed that a regional conflict would become a continental catastrophe. The fatal encounter in Sarajevo had lit the fuse that would detonate the powder keg of European tensions. Chapter 2, Europe Erupts, The Descent into World War Part 1, The July Crisis and the Ultimatum Spiral. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo had created a powder keg, but it was the month that followed that would light the fuse to Europe's destruction. Vienna seethed with rage and opportunity. The aging Habsburg Empire saw the assassination as the perfect excuse to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all. Austria-Hungary's leaders knew they needed backing. On July 5th, Count Alexander Hoyos traveled to Berlin carrying a crucial letter. Emperor Franz Joseph's message to Kaiser Wilhelm II was clear. Serbia must be destroyed as a political factor in the Balkans. The Austrian delegation expected German support, but what they received exceeded their wildest expectations. Kaiser Wilhelm II and his chancellor gave Austria-Hungary what historians would later call the blank check. Germany would stand behind its ally no matter what action Vienna chose to take against Serbia. This unconditional promise emboldened Austrian hawks who had been pushing for war. The die was cast, though few realized how far the consequences would reach. For 3 weeks, Austria-Hungary prepared its ultimatum while keeping its intentions secret from other European powers. Diplomats across Europe enjoyed their summer holidays, unaware that their world was about to collapse. The Austrian government deliberately waited until French President Raymond Poincaré finished his state visit to Russia, ensuring the Allies couldn't coordinate an immediate response. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary delivered its ultimatum to Belgrade. The demands were deliberately harsh, designed to be rejected. Serbia must suppress anti-Austrian publications, dissolve nationalist organizations, arrest suspected conspirators, and most provocatively, allow Austrian officials to participate in the investigation on Serbian soil. This last demand violated Serbian sovereignty and was intended to be unacceptable. Serbia's response surprised many. On July 25th, they accepted nearly every demand but carefully rejected the participation of Austrian officials in their investigation. They offered to submit the dispute to international arbitration. For most European observers, Serbia's reply seemed reasonable, even conciliatory. But Austria-Hungary had already decided on war. On July 25th, the same day Serbia responded, Austria-Hungary ordered partial mobilization. 3 days later, on July 28th, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and began bombarding Belgrade. The regional conflict had begun, but the alliance system would soon transform it into something unimaginable. Russia faced an impossible choice. As protector of Slavic peoples and Serbia's patron, Tsar Nicholas II couldn't abandon Belgrade without losing credibility. On July 30th, Russia ordered partial mobilization to pressure Austria-Hungary, but Russia's military plans, like Germany's, were rigid. Partial mobilization proved impossible to sustain, and on August 1st, Russia ordered general mobilization. Germany's response was swift and mechanical. Their war plan required attacking France through Belgium before Russia could fully mobilize. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, they declared war on France and invaded Belgium. Britain, bound by treaty to protect Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany on August 4th. In just 6 weeks, a regional dispute had engulfed Europe's great powers. The alliance system, designed to preserve peace through deterrence, instead created a catastrophic chain reaction that would reshape the world. Part 2. Invasion of Belgium, Germany's Gamble. As German armies marched toward the French border in August 1914, they faced a fundamental problem that would define the entire war. Their master plan, crafted years earlier by Count von Schlieffen, demanded a lightning-fast campaign against France before Russia could mobilize its massive armies in the east. The German High Command believed they had perhaps 6 weeks to defeat France and race back to confront the Russian bear. The solution seemed elegant in its brutality. Rather than attack France's heavily fortified eastern border, German forces would sweep through neutral Belgium, circle around French defenses, and capture Paris before anyone could react. On paper, the mathematics appeared sound. Belgium's small army could not seriously delay the German juggernaut, and the rapid victory would justify any diplomatic consequences. But this calculated gamble carried enormous risks. Belgium had remained neutral since 1839, protected by international treaties that Britain had signed. German military leaders dismissed this concern, famously calling the Belgian treaty merely a scrap of paper. They assumed Britain would protest but ultimately accept the fait accompli of French defeat. The Belgian government received Germany's ultimatum on August 2nd, demanding free passage for German troops. King Albert and his ministers faced an impossible choice. Resistance meant devastation for their small nation. Compliance meant betraying their neutrality and enabling German conquest of France. After hours of anguished debate, Belgium chose defiance. German troops crossed the Belgian border on August 4th, expecting token resistance. Instead, they encountered fierce fighting at Liège, where Belgian forts held out for days against massive siege artillery. News of the invasion electrified world opinion. The image of mighty Germany crushing tiny Belgium created powerful propaganda for the Allied cause. Britain's response was swift and decisive. The violation of Belgian neutrality provided the perfect justification for war that the British government needed. Public opinion, initially divided about continental entanglements, rallied behind the cause of brave little Belgium. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. The German advance through Belgium proved costlier than anticipated. Belgian resistance, though ultimately futile, delayed the German timetable by crucial days. Civilians fought alongside soldiers in desperate street battles. The German army, frustrated by unexpected resistance, responded harshly. Reports of executed civilians and burned cities shocked neutral nations and hardened Allied resolve. Meanwhile, the delay allowed French forces to redeploy and British troops to land in France. Every day lost in Belgium gave the Allies precious time to prepare their defenses. The German plan required mathematical precision, but war rarely follows mathematical equations. By late August, German forces had swept through most of Belgium and were approaching the French border. The Schlieffen Plan was working, but behind schedule. The violation of Belgian neutrality had achieved its immediate military objective while creating unexpected political consequences that would prove far more significant than German leaders had imagined. This calculated risk had transformed a European war into a global conflict, bringing the British Empire and its vast resources into the fight. The stage was now set for the decisive battle that would determine whether Germany's gamble would succeed or fail catastrophically. Part 3. France's Stand, the Miracle on the Marne. By early September 1914, German forces had advanced deep into France, their gray columns marching steadily toward Paris. The French government had already fled to Bordeaux, and panic gripped the capital as citizens could hear the distant rumble of artillery. General Helmuth von Moltke, commanding the German forces, believed victory was within grasp. His armies had swept through Belgium faster than expected and now stood less than 30 miles from Paris, seemingly unstoppable. But the Schlieffen Plan, brilliant on paper, was cracking under the strain of reality. The German First Army, led by General Alexander von Kluck, had become stretched thin across the French countryside. Supply lines extended hundreds of miles back to Germany, and exhausted soldiers had been marching for weeks. More critically, von Kluck made a fateful decision that would change everything. Instead of encircling Paris as originally planned, he turned his army southeast to pursue retreating French forces, exposing his right flank. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch spotted this opportunity immediately. From his headquarters, he coordinated with General Joseph Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, who had been quietly repositioning his forces for a massive counterattack. The French Sixth Army, commanded by General Michel-Joseph Montgomery, moved into position north of Paris, while British forces under Field Marshal Sir John French prepared to strike the gap that had opened between German armies. On September 5th, the counteroffensive began along a front stretching from Paris to Verdun. French soldiers, many still wearing their distinctive red trousers despite the obvious target they created, charged across wheat fields toward German positions. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, with neither side fully understanding the scope of the battle as it developed. Villages changed hands multiple times in a single day, and commanders struggled to maintain communication across the sprawling battlefield. The most famous moment came when General Gallieni requisitioned every taxi in Paris to rush reinforcements to the front. 600 Parisian taxi drivers became unlikely heroes, ferrying soldiers to battle in what became known as the Taxis of the Marne. This improvised transportation symbolized the desperate creativity both sides employed as the battle raged. For 6 days, the outcome remained uncertain. German forces fought fiercely, but their commanders began to recognize the precarious position. The gap between armies widened, and French attacks intensified. On September 9th, von Moltke ordered a general retreat to the Aisne River, effectively admitting that Germany's bid for quick victory had failed. The Battle of the Marne transformed World War I from a war of movement into something far more sinister. Both armies began digging defensive positions along the Aisne, creating the first permanent trench lines. The dream of a swift victory died in the muddy fields of France, replaced by the grim reality that this conflict would consume years, not months. Europe now faced a war unlike any it had ever known. Part 4. Opening New Fronts. Empires at War. As the trenches began their deadly embrace across the Western Front, generals in distant capitals realized that their war would not be contained to European battlefields. The conflict that had started with an assassin's bullet in Sarajevo was about to span continents, drawing in empires that stretched across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The Ottoman Empire's decision to join Germany and Austria-Hungary in October 1914 transformed the strategic landscape overnight. Sultan Mehmed V's declaration of war against the Allies opened vast new theaters of combat. British forces suddenly faced Ottoman armies in Mesopotamia, where oil-rich territories promised to fuel the war machines of either side. In Palestine, British commanders prepared campaigns that would reshape the Middle East forever. The Dardanelles, that narrow strait connecting Europe and Asia, became the target of Allied ambitions as planners dreamed of opening a route to supply Russia. Africa erupted into warfare as European colonial administrators scrambled to mobilize forces thousands of miles from home. German East Africa, under the brilliant leadership of Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, became an unexpected thorn in British plans. With fewer than 15,000 men, mostly local askaris, Lettow-Vorbeck tied down over 130,000 Allied troops throughout the war. His guerrilla tactics forced Britain to divert precious resources from European fronts to hunt his elusive columns through the African bush. The war at sea expanded beyond anyone's expectations. German submarines prowled every ocean, while surface raiders like the Emden terrorized Allied shipping from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. Naval battles erupted off the coasts of Chile and the Falklands as British and German squadrons clashed far from European waters. The Royal Navy found itself stretched thin, protecting convoys and hunting enemy vessels across vast oceanic expanses. Colonial troops became crucial players in this expanded conflict. French forces included thousands of soldiers from Algeria and Morocco. British armies incorporated Indians, Canadians, Australians, and South Africans. These men fought and died in theaters far from their homelands, their sacrifices often forgotten in later accounts that focused solely on European battlefields. At Gallipoli, Australian and New Zealand troops would face Ottoman defenders in battles that forged national identities through shared tragedy. The global nature of the conflict meant that local disputes between colonial powers suddenly carried international weight. Border skirmishes that might have remained minor diplomatic incidents now became extensions of the greater war. Every German colony, every Ottoman province, every neutral port became a potential battleground or strategic prize. By late 1914, what had begun as a European crisis had become humanity's first truly global war. The Western Front's trenches represented just one face of a conflict that now touched every continent. As soldiers dug deeper into French soil, their comrades were already fighting under African suns, Middle Eastern deserts, and Pacific islands. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas had instead spread like wildfire across the world's map, creating a conflict whose scale and complexity would test every empire's resolve. Part 5. Stalemate in the Trenches. The global expansion of conflict created new pressures that would force dramatic changes on the Western Front. As empires mobilized resources from across their territories, commanders realized that quick victories were becoming impossible. The very scale of the war demanded new approaches to fighting. By late 1914, the failed German offensive and successful French counterattack at the Marne had created something unexpected. Neither side could advance decisively, yet neither could afford to retreat. Soldiers who had marched confidently toward enemy positions now found themselves desperately seeking cover from increasingly deadly firepower. The first trenches appeared almost by accident. Exhausted troops scraped shallow holes in the earth to escape rifle fire and artillery shells. What began as temporary shelter quickly became permanent fortification. Within weeks, these crude ditches evolved into elaborate underground cities, stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Machine guns transformed the battlefield into a killing field. These weapons, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, made traditional cavalry charges and infantry assaults suicidal. Any soldier who stood up in daylight faced almost certain death. Artillery bombardments could last for days, turning once peaceful farmland into moonscapes of craters and mud. Between the opposing trenches lay no man's land, a deadly strip of earth bristling with barbed wire. This tangled metal maze, often hundreds of yards wide, trapped attacking soldiers and left them exposed to enemy fire. Corpses hung on the wire for months, creating a grotesque barrier that reminded everyone of previous failed attacks. Life in the trenches was a nightmare of mud, rats, and disease. Soldiers stood in water up to their knees, their feet rotting in waterlogged boots. Rats, grown fat on human corpses, scurried through the tunnels. The stench of death and human waste was overwhelming. Many men went weeks without seeing sunlight, emerging only for night raids or to repair wire. The technology of killing had advanced far beyond the ability to attack successfully. While machine guns and artillery made defense nearly impregnable, military leaders still ordered massive frontal assaults. Hundreds of thousands of men climbed out of their trenches and walked toward enemy positions, only to be mowed down within minutes. Battles now measured success in yards rather than miles. Offensives that cost tens of thousands of lives might capture a single hill or small village. The Battle of Verdun raged for 10 months, consuming 700,000 casualties, while the front lines barely moved. The Somme offensive killed over 1 million men for gains that could be measured on a map with a ruler. This grinding war of attrition would define the conflict for years to come. The Western Front had become a massive graveyard where entire generations would disappear into the mud, setting the stage for new technologies and tactics that would eventually break the deadlock. Chapter 3: The War of Attrition, Turning Points and Continents in Flames. Part 1: Verdun and the Somme, the slaughter fields. By February 1916, German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn faced a stark reality. The Western Front had become a deadly stalemate, consuming men and resources with little territorial gain. His solution was brutally simple: bleed France white. He chose Verdun, an ancient fortress city that held deep symbolic meaning for French national pride, knowing they would defend it at any cost. The German assault began on February 21st with the most concentrated artillery bombardment in history. Over 1 million shells rained down on French positions in just 10 hours. The earth itself seemed to disappear under the relentless pounding. French soldiers cowered in their trenches as the world exploded around them, many driven mad by the constant thunder of shells and the screaming of wounded comrades. Crown Prince Wilhelm commanded the German forces, confident that French resistance would crumble within days. Instead, French General Philippe Pétain arrived to organize the defense, transforming Verdun into a symbol of French determination. The only supply route to the besieged city became known as the Sacred Way, as trucks carried fresh troops in and wounded men out in an endless procession. The battle consumed both armies. German soldiers advanced through a moonscape of craters and corpses, gaining mere yards at enormous cost. French defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that losing Verdun meant more than military defeat. Villages changed hands dozens of times, reduced to piles of rubble where men killed each other with bayonets and grenades in savage close combat. Meanwhile, British forces prepared their own offensive along the Somme River to relieve pressure on Verdun. General Douglas Haig believed a massive assault would break German lines and end the war. On July 1, 1916, after a week-long bombardment, British troops climbed from their trenches and walked toward German positions in neat lines. The Germans had survived the bombardment in deep bunkers. Machine gunners emerged to cut down advancing British soldiers like wheat before a scythe. Within hours, 60,000 British casualties littered the battlefield, with 20,000 dead. It was the bloodiest day in British military history, yet the offensive continued for months. Both battles raged simultaneously, creating twin furnaces that consumed entire generations. At Verdun, soldiers spoke of the constant smell of death and the impossibility of burying all the bodies. The Somme became a similar charnel house, where men disappeared into the mud and were never found. By December 1916, Verdun had claimed 700,000 casualties from both sides. The Somme cost over 1 million men for gains measured in miles. Neither battle achieved its strategic objectives, but both demonstrated the war's horrific evolution into industrial-scale killing. These battles drained the fighting spirit from entire nations and marked the point where World War I transformed from a conflict with clear goals into a grinding war of survival. Part 2: Gallipoli and the Wider World. While the Western Front consumed nations in bloody stalemate, British leaders desperately sought a breakthrough elsewhere. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, believed he had found the answer in the narrow waterway separating Europe from Asia. The Dardanelles Strait, controlled by Ottoman Turkey, represented Britain's lifeline to Russia. If Allied forces could seize this passage, ships carrying vital supplies would reach their struggling eastern ally, potentially keeping Russia in the fight. The plan seemed elegant in its simplicity. Naval bombardment would silence Turkish forts guarding the strait, allowing ships to sail through to Constantinople. The Ottoman capital would fall, Turkey would surrender, and neutral Balkan nations would join the Allied cause. Most importantly, a new front would draw German forces away from France, breaking the deadlock that was bleeding Europe white. Reality proved far more stubborn than theory. On March 18, 1915, Allied warships attempted to force the passage. Turkish mines and artillery devastated the fleet, sinking 3 battleships and damaging others. The naval assault had failed completely, but British commanders refused to abandon their grand strategy. Ground troops would have to finish what the Navy could not. On April 25, 1915, Allied forces landed on the rocky Gallipoli Peninsula. Australian and New Zealand soldiers, fighting their first major battle as independent nations, scrambled ashore under withering Turkish fire. These Anzac troops, along with British, French, and colonial forces, found themselves trapped on narrow beaches beneath steep cliffs bristling with enemy positions. What followed was 8 months of warfare that made the Western Front's trenches seem spacious by comparison. Men lived and died in positions separated by mere yards, so close they could hear their enemies breathing. The rocky ground made digging impossible, leaving soldiers exposed to sniper fire and artillery. Summer heat brought dysentery and disease that killed as efficiently as bullets. Turkish forces, led by a young colonel named Mustafa Kemal, fought with desperate courage. They understood that their empire's survival depended on holding these heights. Every Allied advance met fierce resistance. Every Turkish counterattack faced determined defenders. The campaign that was supposed to end quickly stretched into autumn, then winter. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles proved inadequate for the massive undertaking. Ammunition ran short, medical supplies dwindled, and fresh water became precious as gold. Men died not just from enemy fire, but from diseases that proper logistics might have prevented. By December 1915, even the most optimistic commanders recognized the campaign's failure. The evacuation began in January 1916, ironically, the operation's only complete success. Over 250,000 Allied casualties had purchased nothing but bitter experience and national awakening for Australia and New Zealand, who would forever mark Anzac Day as their true birth as nations. The failure at Gallipoli ensured that Russia would remain isolated, eventually collapsing under the strain of fighting alone. Part 3. Battle at Sea. The Clash at Jutland. With Russia cut off and bleeding, the war's focus returned to the waters between Britain and Germany, where a different kind of isolation threatened to decide the conflict's fate. The Royal Navy's blockade had slowly strangled German ports, cutting off vital supplies and starving civilian populations. By May 1916, German Admiral Reinhard Scheer knew his high seas fleet faced a stark choice: break out into the Atlantic or watch Germany wither behind British naval walls. On May 31, 1916, the largest naval battle in history began not with grand strategy, but with a chance encounter. Scheer had planned a limited sortie to lure part of the British Grand Fleet into a trap near the Danish coast. What he didn't know was that British codebreakers had read his signals. Admiral John Jellicoe was already racing north with the entire Grand Fleet, 24 dreadnought battleships strong. The first shots came from smaller ships in the afternoon haze. British battlecruisers under Admiral David Beatty spotted German counterparts and immediately engaged. Within minutes, HMS Indefatigable exploded in a towering column of flame, taking over 1,000 sailors with her. Then HMS Queen Mary met the same fate, prompting Beatty's famous remark, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." As evening approached, the main fleets finally met in the gray North Sea. Jellicoe had achieved the Royal Navy's dream since 1914, forcing the German fleet into open battle. His ships formed a perfect line across the German path, their guns trained on Scheer's trapped vessels. For 20 minutes, British dreadnoughts pounded the German line with devastating accuracy. But Scheer proved as cunning as he was desperate. Using smoke screens and a brilliant tactical maneuver, he turned his entire fleet away simultaneously, vanishing into the growing darkness. The Germans had escaped Jellicoe's trap, but at tremendous cost. Throughout the night, scattered engagements continued as German ships fought desperately to reach home ports. When dawn broke on June 1st, both fleets had withdrawn. The Germans claimed victory, having sunk more British ships and killed more sailors. The British claimed victory because the German fleet never again challenged their control of the seas. Both sides were partially correct, but the strategic reality remained unchanged. The Battle of Jutland confirmed what many had suspected. Britain's naval supremacy would continue, but at a price higher than anyone had imagined. The blockade tightened further around Germany's ports, while German U-boats prepared for unrestricted warfare against Allied shipping. The sea had proven as deadly and indecisive as the trenches, setting the stage for an even more desperate phase of the war. Part 4. The Eastern Front: Catastrophe and Collapse. While the Western Front settled into its deadly stalemate, catastrophe was brewing in the vast expanses of Eastern Europe. The Russian Empire, that massive colossus stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, would soon discover that size alone could not guarantee survival against modern warfare. In August 1914, Russian armies thundered into East Prussia with confidence born of sheer numbers. General Alexander Samsonov commanded the Second Army, while General Paul von Rennenkampf led the First Army. Their plan seemed straightforward: crush the Germans between two massive forces and march triumphantly toward Berlin. What could go wrong when you outnumbered your enemy nearly 3-1? Everything, as it turned out. The German commanders, Paul von Hindenburg and his brilliant chief of staff Erich von Falkenhayn, recognized the danger but also saw opportunity. The Russian armies were separated by the Masurian lakes, unable to support each other effectively. Their communications were chaotic. Their supply lines stretched thin across hostile territory. At Tannenberg, the trap closed with devastating efficiency. German forces concentrated against Samsonov's isolated Second Army, surrounding it completely. In 4 days of fighting, an entire Russian army simply ceased to exist. Nearly 100,000 men were captured, while Samsonov, overwhelmed by the disaster, walked into the forest and shot himself rather than face the shame of such complete defeat. The Masurian Lakes battle followed shortly after, delivering another crushing blow to Russian hopes. Rennenkampf's First Army, already shaken by news of Tannenberg, found itself outmaneuvered and forced into headlong retreat. Within weeks, Russian forces had been driven from East Prussia entirely, leaving behind mountains of equipment and tens of thousands of prisoners. These defeats sent shockwaves through the Russian Empire. Soldiers who had marched to war singing patriotic songs now trudged home in defeat, their faith in the Tsar's military machine badly shaken. Officers who had seemed invincible were revealed as incompetent, their grand strategies crumbling at first contact with German efficiency. The human cost was staggering. Entire regiments vanished from the army rolls. Villages across the Russian countryside received news that their young men would never return. The defeats at Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes claimed nearly 200,000 casualties, a number that represented not just military failure, but the beginning of social collapse. More dangerous still was what these disasters revealed about Russian society itself. The army's communications failures exposed the empire's primitive infrastructure. The inability to supply troops properly highlighted industrial weakness. Most troubling of all, the defeats demonstrated that Russia's autocratic system, so confident in its divine mandate, could not adapt to modern warfare's demands. As news of the Eastern Front disasters reached St. Petersburg, whispers of discontent grew louder in the salons and factories. The contrast with the Western Front was stark. While French and British armies held their ground despite enormous casualties, Russian forces seemed to collapse at the first serious test. This military failure would soon transform into something far more dangerous for the Tsarist regime, a crisis of legitimacy that would shake the very foundations of Russian society and create the conditions for revolution. Part 5. New Technologies, New Horrors: Gas, Aerial Warfare, and Tanks. As Russian armies crumbled in the east, the Western Front became a laboratory for new forms of destruction. The static nature of trench warfare created a desperate need for innovations that could break the stalemate, but each technological breakthrough brought horrors no one had imagined. The first terror came in the form of a pale yellow-green cloud drifting across no man's land near Ypres in April 1915. German engineers had released chlorine gas, watching as Allied soldiers fled in panic from something their training had never prepared them for. Those caught in the toxic fog clawed at their throats, their lungs burning from the inside. Within minutes, what had been a normal morning became a scene from hell. Fritz Haber, the German chemist who developed poison gas, believed his creation would end the war quickly and save lives overall. Instead, it opened a Pandora's box of chemical warfare. Both sides escalated rapidly, developing mustard gas that blistered skin and phosgene that killed silently. Soldiers learned to live with gas masks perpetually at their sides, their faces marked with red welts from rubber seals pressed tight against panicked flesh. Meanwhile, the skies above the battlefield transformed from peaceful blue expanses into contested territory. What began with flimsy reconnaissance aircraft evolved into aerial duels between fighter planes. Pilots like Manfred von Richthofen became celebrities, but behind the romantic image of aerial knights lay a brutal reality. Early aircraft were flying coffins with no parachutes, their canvas wings catching fire easily. Many pilots carried pistols not to fight enemies, but to end their own suffering if flames engulfed their cockpits. Artillery observers in balloons became prime targets, hanging helplessly in wicker baskets while enemy fighters strafed them with incendiary bullets. The psychological impact was immense. Soldiers who had always found safety by digging deeper now faced death from above. By 1916, British engineers introduced another game-changer, the tank. These mechanical monsters, originally called land ships, crawled across battlefields like prehistoric beasts. At Cambrai in 1917, hundreds of tanks advanced together, crushing barbed wire and crossing trenches that had stopped human waves for years. German soldiers fled in terror from these iron giants, their rifles useless against thick armor plating. Yet these technological marvels came with their own nightmares. Tank crews cooked alive in metal ovens during summer battles. Gas shells turned enclosed spaces into death traps. Aircraft crashes became so common that airfields resembled graveyards. Each innovation designed to restore mobility to warfare instead created new forms of suffering. The war had become a contest between human ingenuity and human endurance, with technology consistently outpacing the ability to protect those who wielded it. As 1917 dawned, these horrific innovations would converge with political upheaval to reshape the conflict entirely, as America prepared to enter a war that had already redefined the very meaning of human destruction. Chapter 4. The World at Breaking Point. Revolutions, Renewed Fury, and Final Blows. Part Year of Upheaval. America enters, Russia burns. As 1917 dawned, Europe's great powers teetered on the edge of complete exhaustion. 3 years of mechanized slaughter had drained treasuries, decimated populations, and shattered the confident assumptions that launched this conflict. Yet the year ahead would bring transformations that would fundamentally alter the war's trajectory and reshape the global order. Kaiser Wilhelm II faced an impossible choice in early 1917. Germany's surface fleet remained bottled up by British naval superiority, leaving submarines as the only weapon capable of strangling Britain's vital supply lines. The decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare represented a calculated gamble that would either force Britain to sue for peace or drag America into the war. German naval commanders argued they could sink 600,000 tons of Allied shipping monthly, bringing Britain to its knees before American troops could cross the Atlantic in meaningful numbers. President Woodrow Wilson had campaigned on keeping America out of European entanglements, but German U-boats made neutrality increasingly untenable. When submarines began sinking American merchant vessels without warning, public opinion shifted dramatically. The infamous Zimmermann telegram, intercepted by British intelligence, revealed Germany's attempt to forge an alliance with Mexico against the United States. Wilson appeared before Congress on April 2, 1917, declaring that the world must be made safe for democracy. America's entry brought fresh resources, industrial capacity, and eventually 2 million soldiers to the Allied cause. Meanwhile, Russia convulsed in revolutionary ferment. Tsar Nicholas II had taken personal command of Russian forces in 1915, linking his dynasty's fate directly to military success. Instead, catastrophic defeats and supply shortages created conditions for political collapse. Bread riots in Petrograd during March 1917 spiraled into general revolution. The Tsar abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule, as a provisional government attempted to maintain Russian participation in the war. Alexander Kerensky's provisional government fatally misjudged the national mood by launching fresh offensives against German lines. Russian soldiers, already demoralized by endless casualties and equipment shortages, began deserting en masse. Vladimir Lenin returned from exile with German assistance, promising peace, land, and bread to a war-weary population. His Bolshevik party seized power in October 1917, immediately opening negotiations with Germany. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 removed Russia from the war entirely, allowing Germany to transfer hundreds of thousands of troops to the Western Front. Yet this apparent advantage came too late. American soldiers were already arriving in France, bringing fresh energy to exhausted Allied armies. Russia's exit had given Germany breathing space, but America's entry promised to tip the balance decisively against the Central Powers. These parallel developments in 1917 created the conditions for the war's final phase. Germany now faced a race against time, needing decisive victory before American strength could fully manifest itself on European battlefields. Part 2. Nivelle and Passchendaele, the desperation of 1917. Even as fresh American doughboys stepped off transport ships in French ports throughout 1917, the Western Front remained trapped in its deadly embrace of barbed wire and machine guns. French General Robert Nivelle believed he had found the solution that had eluded his predecessors. Unlike the cautious Joffre before him, Nivelle promised his government something irresistible: a swift, decisive breakthrough that would end the war in 48 hours. Nivelle's confidence stemmed from his success at Verdun, where limited attacks had recaptured key positions. He convinced himself and French politicians that these tactics could work on a massive scale along the Chemin des Dames Ridge. The plan called for a coordinated assault involving over 1 million French soldiers, supported by British diversionary attacks further north. Nivelle spoke with such certainty that even doubting generals felt compelled to support his vision. The offensive launched on April 16, 1917, into immediate disaster. German forces, forewarned by captured French plans, had strengthened their defenses and withdrawn to better positions. French soldiers charged across no man's land into carefully prepared killing fields. Artillery barrages that were supposed to clear the way had barely scratched German concrete bunkers. Within hours, it became clear that Nivelle's promised breakthrough was a fantasy built on wishful thinking. French casualties mounted horrifically. Instead of advancing kilometers, most units gained only meters of worthless ground. After 10 days of futile attacks, the offensive had cost 187,000 French casualties, while achieving virtually nothing. Worse than the tactical failure was its psychological impact on French soldiers who had been promised quick victory and instead found themselves dying for yet another general's miscalculation. The breaking point came swiftly. French units began refusing orders to attack. Mutinies spread through the army like wildfire as soldiers abandoned their posts or marched singing revolutionary songs instead of advancing toward German positions. Nearly half the French army became unreliable, with entire divisions declaring they would defend their trenches but never again participate in pointless offensives. General Philippe Pétain replaced Nivelle and worked desperately to restore discipline through a combination of limited executions and genuine reforms. He improved food, leave policies, and living conditions, while secretly promising soldiers that France would wait for American reinforcements before attempting major offensives again. The French army gradually stabilized, but its offensive capability remained shattered for months. With France effectively paralyzed, British forces assumed the primary burden of maintaining pressure on Germany. Field Marshal Haig launched his own massive offensive at Ypres in July 1917, aiming to break through German lines and capture Belgian ports used by German submarines. The Third Battle of Ypres, later known as Passchendaele, began with optimism, but quickly devolved into something approaching hell on earth. Unprecedented rainfall turned the Ypres salient into a swamp of mud, blood, and shattered bodies. British, Canadian, Australian, and South African troops struggled forward through conditions that defied human endurance. Soldiers drowned in shell holes filled with contaminated water. The wounded often died simply because stretcher-bearers couldn't navigate the glutinous landscape fast enough to save them. For 3 months, Allied forces pushed forward yard by yard, capturing the ruined village of Passchendaele at a cost of over 300,000 casualties. The advance measured barely 5 miles. Meanwhile, German defenders, fighting from concrete pillboxes and strategically placed machine gun nests, inflicted devastating losses while suffering far fewer themselves. The offensive finally ground to a halt in November, when even Haig acknowledged that continuation was impossible. The twin disasters of Nivelle's offensive and Passchendaele revealed the complete bankruptcy of existing military strategy. 3 years of war had produced refined techniques for killing, but no viable method for achieving decisive victory. Both sides had perfected defensive systems that could absorb enormous punishment while inflicting catastrophic casualties on attackers. As 1917 ended, Allied morale hung by threads. French soldiers remained mutinous, British forces were exhausted, and Russian collapse had freed German divisions for transfer westward. The year that began with such hope for breakthrough had instead demonstrated that the war might continue indefinitely, grinding down entire generations in its mechanical brutality. Germany now prepared to stake everything on one final gamble before American strength could tip the balance permanently against the Central Powers. Part 3. The German Spring Offensives. As winter turned to spring in 1918, General Erich Ludendorff faced a military equation that seemed impossible to solve. The arrival of Lenin's government had gifted Germany something precious: 50 divisions freed from the Eastern Front. But this windfall came with an expiration date. Every week brought fresh American soldiers to France, and by summer their numbers would make German victory impossible. Ludendorff gambled everything on speed. On March 21st, Operation Michael exploded against British lines near Amiens with devastating force. German stormtroopers, trained in revolutionary tactics, punched through Allied defenses using concentrated artillery barrages, followed by swift infantry advances that bypassed strong points. The sight of retreating British soldiers stunned observers who had grown accustomed to static warfare. The initial breakthrough exceeded all expectations. German forces advanced 40 miles in 5 days, reclaiming territory that had cost hundreds of thousands of casualties to capture. Panic rippled through Allied headquarters as commanders contemplated the unthinkable: total collapse of their defensive line. French General Foch rushed reinforcements northward, while British units fell back in disorder. Yet success bred its own problems. German soldiers, malnourished after years of blockade, stopped to loot abandoned British supply depots. Discipline crumbled as hungry troops gorged themselves on food their homeland hadn't seen in years. The advance slowed to a crawl as exhausted men struggled across the moonscape of old battlefields. Ludendorff launched 4 more massive assaults through July, each following the same pattern. Brilliant initial gains dissolved into logistical chaos and mounting casualties. The German army, weakened by 4 years of attrition, lacked reserves to exploit breakthroughs. Storm units that spearheaded attacks suffered devastating losses among their most experienced soldiers. By midsummer, the offensive had consumed Germany's last strategic reserves without achieving decisive victory. American divisions poured into France at a rate of 300,000 men per month, while German replacements consisted increasingly of teenagers and older men unfit for sustained combat. The sight of fresh-faced American troops marching toward the front lines while German prisoners shuffled rearward told the story of shifting momentum. The final German attack near Reims in July collapsed within days. Allied forces, now unified under Foch's command, had learned to bend without breaking. They absorbed German advances, then counterattacked with devastating effect. The army that had conquered Belgium, defeated Russia, and terrorized Europe for 4 years finally reached its breaking point. As August dawned, Ludendorff's great gamble lay in ruins. The spring offensives had cost Germany nearly 1 million casualties while advancing the Allies' strategic position. The temporary advantage from Russia's collapse had been squandered. Now, with American strength fully deployed and German reserves exhausted, the initiative passed decisively to the Allies, setting the stage for the final act of the world's first global war. Part 4. Allied Counterattack, the 100 Days. The German army that had terrorized Europe for 4 years was about to face its reckoning. By August 1918, Ferdinand Foch commanded not just French forces, but a truly unified Allied machine. British, French, Canadian, Australian, and crucially, 2 million fresh American soldiers stood ready to strike. The Americans brought something Germany could no longer match: unlimited reserves of young men who had never known the soul-crushing despair of trench warfare. The transformation began on August 8th at Amiens. British and Canadian forces, supported by hundreds of tanks, smashed through German lines in what Ludendorff would call the Black Day of the German Army. The attack succeeded not through the familiar pattern of costly frontal assaults, but through coordinated surprise. Aircraft provided intelligence while tanks carved paths through barbed wire. For the first time in 4 years, Allied forces advanced miles rather than yards. What made this offensive different was its relentless momentum. Previous Allied attacks had stalled after initial success, allowing Germans to regroup. Now, Foch orchestrated a series of hammer blows that never let the enemy recover. As German resistance cracked at Amiens, French forces struck at Montdidier. Before those defenders could stabilize their positions, British troops attacked near Albert. The Germans faced the nightmare scenario their military doctrine had tried to prevent: fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. American forces proved their worth at St. Mihiel in September, where General Pershing's independent American army eliminated a German salient that had existed since 1914. The speed of their success surprised even Allied commanders. Within 4 days, American troops had captured 15,000 prisoners and 450 guns. More importantly, they had demonstrated that fresh soldiers, properly equipped and led, could accomplish what years of European sacrifice had failed to achieve. The final phase began with the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Over 1 million American soldiers, fighting alongside French forces, pushed northward through some of the war's most heavily fortified territory. German resistance remained fierce, but their army was disintegrating. Units surrendered in unprecedented numbers. Officers reported that their men simply walked away from positions rather than face another Allied assault. By October, the strategic situation had become hopeless for Germany. The Hindenburg Line, their supposedly impregnable defensive system, lay in ruins. Allied forces were advancing on all fronts, while German reserves had evaporated. Perhaps most critically, the home front was collapsing. Naval mutinies spread to civilian uprisings as news of military disasters reached German cities. The 100 Days had accomplished what 4 years of grinding attrition could not. Through coordinated offensives and overwhelming material superiority, the Allies had broken German military power. As November approached, revolution erupted across Germany's remaining allies, making continuation of the war impossible. Part 5. The Collapse of Empires. By November 1918, the great empires that had dominated Europe for centuries began crumbling from within. The military defeats of the 100 Days Offensive had shattered more than just German battle lines. They had broken the very foundations upon which 3 ancient dynasties rested. Austria-Hungary felt the tremors first. Emperor Franz Joseph's patchwork empire, held together by imperial tradition and bureaucratic momentum, started splitting along ethnic fault lines that had simmered for decades. Czechs in Prague declared independence and formed Czechoslovakia. Hungarians renounced their ties to Vienna and proclaimed their own republic. Croats and Serbs united with Serbia to form Yugoslavia. Polish territories merged with Russian Poland to recreate an independent Polish state. The Habsburg military, already weakened by years of costly campaigns against Russia and Italy, simply dissolved. Soldiers abandoned their posts to return home to their newly forming nations. Officers found themselves commanding phantom armies as entire regiments melted away. By late October, the dual monarchy existed only on paper. The Ottoman Empire faced a similar fate across the Middle East and Anatolia. British forces under General Allenby had captured Jerusalem and Damascus, severing Turkish control over the Arab provinces. Armenian and Kurdish populations rose in rebellion, sensing their chance for freedom after centuries of oppression. Turkish armies retreated toward Constantinople as Arab forces, supported by British advisors like T.E. Lawrence, seized control of former Ottoman territories. Sultan Mehmed VI watched helplessly as his empire contracted to its Anatolian heartland. The young Turk leadership fled or went into hiding, leaving the government rudderless. Local commanders signed separate armistices with Allied forces, abandoning any pretense of coordinated resistance. Germany itself teetered on the edge of revolution. The naval mutiny at Kiel had spread like wildfire through northern cities. Workers' councils formed in Munich and Berlin, demanding an end to both the war and the monarchy. Kaiser Wilhelm II, once the proud symbol of German imperial power, found himself increasingly isolated as even his own generals urged him to abdicate. Revolutionary fervor gripped German cities as citizens, exhausted by 4 years of deprivation and loss, took to the streets. The Social Democrats, long suppressed, emerged as a powerful political force demanding immediate peace negotiations. Military discipline collapsed as soldiers joined civilian protesters rather than suppressing them. These simultaneous collapses created a cascade effect that made continuing the war impossible. Each empire's disintegration weakened the others, as nationalist movements gained momentum and military resources evaporated. The Central Powers Alliance, which had once seemed formidable, existed now only in name. By early November, it became clear that the old order was finished. Centuries-old dynasties that had survived countless wars and political upheavals could not withstand the combined pressures of military defeat, economic exhaustion, and popular uprising. The stage was set for a complete transformation of European politics, as new nations emerged from the rubble of fallen empires and revolutionary governments prepared to negotiate an end to the catastrophic conflict. Chapter 5. Peace and Remembrance: The Shattered World Rebuilt Part 1. The Armistice of November 11th. By late October 1918, the German war machine was crumbling from within. Revolution sparked in Kiel when sailors refused orders to launch a final suicidal naval attack against the British fleet. The mutiny spread like wildfire across German ports and cities, with workers and soldiers forming councils and demanding an end to the fighting that had consumed their nation for 4 brutal years. Kaiser Wilhelm II, once the proud ruler of Europe's most powerful military force, found himself increasingly isolated. His generals informed him that the army could no longer hold the line. General Ludendorff, architect of Germany's spring offensive, had already fled the country. The Western Front was collapsing as Allied forces pushed deeper into German-held territory, while at home, food shortages and war exhaustion had turned the population against their leaders. On November 8th, a German delegation crossed into Allied territory carrying a white flag. Led by Matthias Erzberger, a civilian politician rather than a military commander, they traveled through the devastated French countryside in a train car that would become famous. The delegation arrived at Marshal Ferdinand Foch's headquarters in a railway carriage stationed in the Compiègne forest. Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, presented terms that were harsh but not negotiable. Germany must evacuate all occupied territories immediately, surrender vast quantities of military equipment, and allow Allied forces to occupy German territory west of the Rhine River. The German Navy would be interned, and the crushing Allied blockade would continue until a final peace treaty was signed. The German delegates protested that these conditions would leave their nation defenseless, but they had no choice. Revolution was spreading across Germany, and the Habsburg Empire was dissolving. Austria-Hungary had already signed its own armistice. Germany stood alone, facing certain military defeat if fighting continued. Back in Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm finally abdicated on November 9th, fleeing to neutral Holland as his empire collapsed around him. A republic was hastily proclaimed, but the new government's first priority was ending the war that was destroying their country. At 5 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed in Foch's railway car. The fighting would cease at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. 6 hours remained for the killing to stop. When the moment arrived, an eerie silence fell across the Western Front. Soldiers on both sides emerged cautiously from their trenches, hardly believing that the guns had finally fallen quiet. Some wept openly, others cheered, but many simply stood in stunned disbelief. The Great War was over, but the world it left behind was forever changed. 4 empires had collapsed, millions lay dead, and the map of Europe would never look the same again. Part 2. Treaty of Versailles and Broken Promises. The silence that settled over Europe in November 1918 proved more fragile than anyone imagined. While soldiers stumbled home from the trenches, diplomats in Paris prepared to reshape the world. The peace conference that convened in January 1919 would determine not just Germany's fate, but the future of entire continents. Woodrow Wilson arrived from America with grand dreams of a just peace. Georges Clemenceau of France harbored darker intentions. Britain's David Lloyd George walked the middle ground between idealism and revenge. These three men, representing the war's victorious powers, would craft a settlement that haunted Europe for decades. Germany had surrendered, believing Wilson's 14 points would guide the peace. They expected negotiations between equals, reasonable terms, and a chance to rebuild. Instead, German delegates found themselves summoned to the Palace of Versailles like prisoners awaiting sentence. No German voice would shape the treaty that bore their nation's surrender. The document presented to Germany in May 1919 shocked even its author's allies. Article 231, the notorious War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept complete responsibility for the conflict. This single sentence justified everything that followed. Massive reparation payments would drain German resources for generations. The army was reduced to 100,000 men, forbidden tanks, aircraft, or submarines. German territory was carved away like pieces of a pie. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. The Saar Basin fell under League of Nations control. Poland received a corridor to the sea, splitting Germany in two. The Rhineland would remain occupied by Allied forces. Most devastating of all, Germany could not unite with Austria, forever preventing the German-speaking world from becoming whole. The German delegation protested desperately. They called the terms a violation of everything Wilson had promised. They warned that such harsh conditions would breed resentment and future conflict. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. Clemenceau had lost too many French sons to show mercy now. Critics emerged immediately, even among the victors. British economist John Maynard Keynes resigned from the conference in disgust, later writing that the treaty's economic terms would destroy European prosperity. He predicted the reparations would crush Germany's ability to trade and recover, dragging down the entire continent's economy with it. Yet on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination, German representatives signed the treaty in Versailles' Hall of Mirrors. The same room where Germany had proclaimed its empire in 1871 now witnessed its humiliation. The war was officially over, but peace remained elusive. The treaty's architects believed they had secured lasting stability through strength. Instead, they had planted seeds of bitterness in German soil. The harsh terms would fuel extremist movements and nationalist anger. Within 2 decades, another Austrian would rise to power, promising to overturn every clause of this hated document. The Great War's peace had merely set the stage for an even greater conflict. Part 3. New Maps, Lost Empires. The ink was barely dry on the Versailles Treaty when mapmakers across Europe began their monumental task. 4 great empires that had dominated the continent for centuries lay in ruins, their borders dissolving like salt in rain. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once stretching from the Alps to the Carpathians, simply ceased to exist. Emperor Franz Joseph's heir, Karl I, had already abdicated, watching helplessly as his realm splintered into a dozen fragments. In Vienna, former imperial bureaucrats packed their files while new flags appeared in windows across the city. Hungary declared independence under Bela Kun's communist government, though it would last mere months. Czechoslovakia emerged under Tomáš Masaryk, combining Czechs and Slovaks who had spent centuries under Austrian rule. Yugoslavia formed as South Slavs united under Serbian leadership, bringing together peoples who spoke similar languages but harbored deep cultural differences. The most dramatic transformation occurred in Eastern Europe, where the Russian Empire's collapse created an entirely new landscape. Poland reappeared on maps after 123 years of partition, its borders carved from German, Austrian, and Russian territories. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania claimed independence from the chaos of the Russian Revolution. These new nations faced immediate challenges as ethnic minorities found themselves suddenly foreign in their ancestral homes. Further south, the Ottoman Empire's death throes created even greater complexity. British and French officials gathered in London, drawing lines across Middle Eastern deserts with rulers and red ink. The Sykes-Picot Agreement had already divided Ottoman territories between European powers, But implementing these decisions on the ground proved far more difficult than anticipated. Palestine became a British mandate, with London promising the same land to both Arabs and Jews through contradictory wartime agreements. Syria fell under French control, though Arab nationalists had expected independence after fighting alongside British forces. Iraq emerged as another British mandate, combining 3 Ottoman provinces with little shared identity beyond opposition to foreign rule. The creation of modern Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk represented the most successful post-war transformation. Kemal rejected the harsh Treaty of Sèvres, fighting a war of independence that established Turkey's current borders. His success inspired nationalist movements across the former Ottoman territories, though few achieved similar results. These border changes created immediate practical problems. Millions of people suddenly found themselves minorities in new countries. German communities in Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland felt abandoned by their homeland. Hungarian populations in Romania faced discrimination from their new government. Ethnic tensions that had simmered under imperial rule now erupted into open conflicts. The peacemakers in Paris had hoped to create stable nation-states based on ethnic principles. Instead, they discovered that centuries of migration and intermarriage had created a complex tapestry where clean ethnic boundaries simply did not exist. Every solution created new problems. Every border drawn left communities divided. These hasty decisions would echo through the 20th century. The new borders contained the seeds of future conflicts, from the Sudeten crisis that would trigger World War II to the ethnic wars that would tear apart Yugoslavia 7 decades later. The old empires were gone, but the world they left behind remained dangerously unstable. Part 4. The Human Cost. Mourning the Lost Generation. The numbers told only part of the story. By November 1918, over 10 million soldiers lay dead across the battlefields of Europe, their bodies scattered from the Somme to the Eastern Front. Britain alone had lost nearly 1 million men, France even more. An entire generation of young men had vanished into the mud and barbed wire, leaving behind empty chairs at dinner tables and photographs gathering dust on mantelpieces. But the dead were just the beginning. For every soldier killed, 3 more returned home broken in body or mind. Hospitals overflowed with men missing limbs, their faces scarred by gas attacks, their lungs destroyed by poison clouds. These visible wounds were easier to understand than the invisible ones. Thousands of veterans wandered the streets unable to work, their hands shaking uncontrollably, their nights filled with screams as shells exploded again in their dreams. The term shell shock entered common language as families struggled to comprehend what had happened to their sons and husbands. Men who had marched away singing returned as strangers, unable to explain what they had witnessed in the trenches. Some never spoke of the war at all, carrying their trauma in silence until their deaths decades later. Women paid their own price for this catastrophe. Across Europe, millions became widows before their 30th birthdays. They raised children who would never know their fathers, working in factories and fields to survive. The traditional structure of society crumbled as these women discovered they could manage without men, forever changing the social order. The cultural response to this mass grief transformed art and literature. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon stripped away romantic notions of warfare, replacing heroic verses with brutal honesty about fear, pain, and senseless death. Their words captured a generation's disillusionment with the old certainties about honor and sacrifice. In every village across the combatant nations, war memorials rose from the earth like stone flowers. These monuments bore thousands of names, each representing a family's loss and a community's wound. The annual ritual of remembrance became sacred, as survivors gathered each November to recite lists of the dead and promise never to forget. The concept of heroism itself changed forever. The old ideal of glorious death in battle collapsed under the weight of industrial slaughter. Instead, survival became the measure of courage, and the ability to endure horror without losing one's humanity became the new definition of strength. This massive loss of life created a profound shift in how societies viewed war, government, and authority. The generation that survived questioned everything their elders had taught them about duty and patriotism. This skepticism, would shape politics and culture for decades to come, as the world struggled to find meaning in such an enormous sacrifice and to prevent it from happening again. Part 5. Towards a New World, the League of Nations and Lasting Legacies. From the ashes of unprecedented destruction emerged an ambitious dream. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris with grand visions of a world where nations would settle disputes through dialogue rather than bullets. His 14 points promised a new kind of international order, one built on self-determination and collective security. The centerpiece of this vision was the League of Nations, an organization that would serve as humanity's shield against future catastrophes. The delegates who gathered in the ornate halls of Versailles carried the weight of their devastated nations. Wilson spoke passionately about moral diplomacy and lasting peace. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George balanced idealism with practical concerns about maintaining his empire. French Premier Georges Clemenceau, who had witnessed 2 German invasions in his lifetime, remained skeptical of any plan that didn't permanently weaken Germany. These men represented different philosophies about how to prevent another war. The League's structure reflected both hope and compromise. Member nations would pledge to respect each other's territorial integrity and submit disputes to arbitration. Economic sanctions would replace military action as the primary tool of enforcement. The organization would also oversee colonial mandates, theoretically preparing former German and Ottoman territories for eventual independence. On paper, it seemed like humanity had finally learned from its mistakes. Yet fundamental flaws plagued this noble experiment from its inception. The United States Senate rejected Wilson's creation, leaving America outside the very organization its president had championed. Germany was initially excluded, while the Soviet Union remained a pariah state. Without these major powers, the League resembled an exclusive club rather than a truly universal body. When crises emerged in Manchuria, Ethiopia, and the Rhineland during the 1930s, the organization proved toothless. The war had indeed transformed the world in ways beyond political structures. Women who had filled factories and hospitals during the conflict demanded permanent changes in their status. The carnage had accelerated technological innovation, from aviation to medical advances. Colonial subjects who had fought for their European masters began questioning why they deserved freedom while their homelands remained subjugated. Perhaps most significantly, the war had shattered faith in established authorities. Kings had fallen, empires had crumbled, and millions had died following orders from leaders who seemed utterly disconnected from the reality of modern warfare. This crisis of confidence would fuel radical movements across the political spectrum, from communist revolutions to fascist uprisings. The unresolved tensions festered like untreated wounds. German resentment over the Versailles Treaty created fertile ground for extremist politics. Economic instability plagued Europe throughout the 1920s and exploded into global depression by 1929. The colonial mandates promised eventual independence, but delivered continued exploitation. These contradictions would eventually explode into an even more devastating global conflict. The Great War's true legacy lies not in its failed peace settlement, but in its demonstration of humanity's capacity for both unprecedented destruction and remarkable resilience. It marked the end of the old world's certainties and the beginning of our ongoing struggle to build something better from the ruins of the past.